Yeah, so this is going to sound a little different than most of the large model talks you maybe hear. If I do it right, it might even sound almost like a biology talk or something like this. I think we're building, we all kind of know the scaling hypothesis is working, or many of us believe that the scaling hypothesis is working, but I don't think we really understand the mechanisms. And we're building systems that are very complex. They're doing something cool in control, but we don't really understand what they're doing. So I want to take you on a little journey that we've done to kind of try to dig a little deeper, understand what we can actually understand, and say and learn from these big systems that we're starting to build. So the diffusion policy, maybe you know, thank you, and that's what that does. It's amazing. It works really, really well. We think of that, when I'll refer to diffusion policy today, we'll refer to that as a single task imitation learning pipeline. So if you want to fold a t-shirt, you teleoperate the robot to fold the t-shirt. 200 times is our standard, more if it's an important demo. Okay, and the thing you get out is a visual motor policy. So we have vision encoders in, robot joints or end effector encoding in, and action decoding out. And now we use this term large behavior models, LBMs, for the multitask version, right? I'll compare what I mean to that with VLAs and everything in a minute. So this is just, imagine we've been doing diffusion policy at TRI for a couple of years now. We've done a lot of demonstrations. We've tried to be very broad in our curriculum. We're going to put all of those together, all the data we've collected, and we're going to combine OXE and other internet data and put it all into this one big model, right? So we're going to take all of our robot training data, all of our simulation data, all of our online data, put that into one big multitask model. Of course, since we can nowadays, we're going to make this language conditioned and come up with a language conditioned visual motor policy. So this is standard fare now. In my words, the opportunity here is awesome, right? First of all, we're seeing robots do things with their hands that just weren't possible before, including cloth, liquids, and other things like that. There's a potential to program them via imprecise natural language and or a few demonstrations. And we'll talk exactly about sort of that in a minute. And maybe the most subtle thing, which I don't think we really understand yet, is this idea that if you can get something like the common sense we got in large language models for physical intelligence, then that should lead to something like robustness in our policies, right? Something like, robust control was trying to give us before. This is a very different route to a similar end. So let's try to understand that. And for me personally, this is a big deal, right? I mean, I've been thinking about control and dynamics for a long time. This is pretty different than the way we used to talk about it. And but I don't think I think the objects are the same. When we understand it really deeply, I think we're going to say they're more similar than different. Okay, so let's do a starter example here. This is two side-by-side videos. On the one side, I've got the single task version. So it's trained as a diffusion policy. Although the robot is doing many steps here, this is actually trained as a single task. So every demonstration was given for the entire sequence of making an entire breakfast scenario, okay? It's 229 demonstrations because we do some quality assurance, and 229 are what survived, okay? And on the right, we have the same task, but instead of just training on the 229 demonstrations, we take a large behavior model that was pre-trained on all of our existing demonstrations and then just fine-tuned with exactly the same 229 demonstrations. Okay, so that's one of the contrasts I want to study with you today. And they both do remarkably well. This is actually not that cherry-picked. We'll show you the statistics. There's something just a bit better about the way that the pre-trained models rolls out, okay? You can see it in the success rate. You can see it into some more subtle rubrics about how often it pauses, how smooth are the trajectories, okay? And I want to unpack that, and there's something that's making these things better. We felt we're making these things better, okay? But we're biased. We've been, trying pretty hard to build these models. Here's another fun one that we did just recently. So it's trained again as a single long task. This is one that really performs much better once we have the pre-trained model. And it's a level of dexterity that, I don't know, it still surprises me. It's just awesome to watch it work. So this isn't even the best rollout, but because it misses the middle of the apple. I'll show you our good and our bad today. But I like this one because it does some awesome little recoveries in the middle. So you'll see some of the robustness that pops out. And who doesn't love robots with knives, right? So there's a lot of protection around this, just for the record. We are safe. Okay, so I mean, if you've done kinematics, okay, having a long appendage like this and trying to do fine manipulation at the end of a long appendage, that's a pretty complicated fine motor task, okay? We go through and do the job. It's going to chop up the apple. But I want to draw your attention to this piece, okay? Little things that happen that just are just amazing. Okay, so this one right here, it kind of pops off. Those little recovery maneuvers are just like, oh, I love that. I love that. And you can find some things like that in the single task training for this behavior, but they pop out, we think they pop out more. We're quantifying this, and I'll show you the kind of data and the way we're quantifying this. And just because it's a fun, I'll let it just play out here. Got to clean the knife because we cut a lot of apples that day. And then even sheath the knife, which is, when it fails, it normally fails at that step. I got to tell you, that's the hard one, right? Okay, so this is just a level of dexterity that I didn't expect from our robots a few years ago. And I'll show you some time lapse. Doesn't always succeed, but it's pretty good. It's pretty good. Okay. So let me just ask the most basic question here. Does all this pre-training that we're all talking about, does it really help? If I just care about the quality of my dexterous manipulation, is pre-training a path to making that really work well? It's such a basic statement. I think we all believe it to be true, but I really want to come at you, saying that we're biased, right? I'm biased. I want it to be true so much. But I've been shy to talk about it until I was very confident that we had evidence to support that it's true, and I don't want to. I mean, I think we're in a time of great excitement, of great hype, and I want to, keep myself to the highest possible standards, so that hopefully you believe me when I say the things I say. Do we actually have evidence that pre-training makes dexterous manipulation better, right? If yes, how precisely is it better? Let's get another level of detail. And on the practical side, maybe you already believe that and you don't need to be convinced, but I think a lot of the things we'll talk about today are just about building the right tools to be able to even make the decisions that you need to make quickly. If you're iterating over policy architectures or data sets or whatever like this, do we have the tools to make those design decisions quickly? So I want to, as a scientist, I want to sort of tell you the hypotheses as I wrote them down like a year and a half ago, right? The way you're supposed to do science is you say your hypotheses, you lock them in a box, and you're not allowed to change them after you've seen your data, okay? So I regret a few things about this, but it's close. And so let me just talk you through this. So the first thing I wanted to see in the multitask scaling laws was that if I train a diffusion policy, for instance, and it's my first ever diffusion policy, the first skill I've ever trained, the first task I've ever trained, then maybe it takes about 150 demonstrations to get 80% success rate. Of course, it depends a lot on what task and everything like this. But if I've already trained 1,000 tasks, then you'd like to say that I could add a new task with many fewer demonstrations, right? So maybe if I've trained enough, then maybe I just give a single demonstration, the model understands what I want, and that's enough to fully do the task. And the hope was that actually it's not a step change and you just have to keep giving demonstrations until you reach like robot enlightenment, right? That somehow there's a smooth glide path, that somehow we get a nice scaling law that sort of says that the more skills we have, the better we get. So that was the first thing we looked for. The second one is a statement about robustness. Of course, you'd like to think that even if you got only 80% success rate on your first skill, that when you've trained a lot of skills, you'd like to see that the robustness goes up. We're getting used to seeing low success rates in our learning, but maybe the path to real robustness is actually by large-scale pre-training on diverse tasks. And that's an examination where we go and look for recovery that sort of transfers from other tasks. Okay, the basic idea is, well, maybe even the stronger version of the statement would be, imagine you just cared about one task. You're a small business, you just have one thing you really want the robot to do well. and you've got a budget. Let's say you can afford 10,000 demonstrations. Are you better off doing 10,000 demonstrations of that single task you care about? Or are you better off doing a diversity of tasks and hoping for transfer under that same budget, right? That's a deep question that I don't think we have a good answer for. And the reason I believe it could be true, I mean, I remember in the days of when I was working on autonomous driving, we talked all about the long tails, right? So you get lots and lots of highway miles, lots of highway miles, and that data doesn't do you that. That's not the most valuable data. You wait a long time to get these rare events, right? And in manipulation, I think we have a different opportunity. We don't have to do just the one task. We can actually explore the space by doing different tasks, which kind of excite motions and recoveries in different parts of the space, which can then be synthesized in a way that could potentially provide sort of the long tail coverage on the task you care about. So that's kind of the idea. All right, so let me, again, try to be a little bit scientific here. Let me just tell you the method that we're going to use to dig into some of these questions. So we're playing with a couple different types of robots now, but the main focus has still been on the bimanual manipulation. These two bimanual pandas you see with the grippers and the wrist cameras, scene cameras. We do all kinds of cool tasks. I'll show you the bike rotor at the end if we have time. Okay, let's talk about the architectures. There's a handful of different ways that you could build a large behavior model. I use large behavior model. We have used at TRI for a couple of years now the term large behavior model as a kind of an umbrella of this visually language conditioned visual motor policy. And you could do that with just scaling up diffusion policy. You could stick a language encoding on the front of a diffusion policy, maybe scale up the parameters a bit, and that is a large behavior model. You could do a vision language action model. This is, the name is being used a lot. I would try to just put a sort of, I'd call any model that's using VLM pre-training or co-training, and I would call that a VLA. And I try to use different words for things that were not pre-trained with a VLM sort of recipe. For instance, another base model that you could start with is a video prediction model, right? And that's trained sort of fundamentally differently, although, of course, it's inevitable that VLMs and VLMs will come together in the not too distant future. So this slide will expire before the next time I put it in my lecture notes, yeah. Okay, and TRI actually has a strong team working on video models, so this is one we take very seriously. We're trying to build video model backends also. But just because we've gotten as very far in these specific questions, I decided today to talk about this multitask diffusion policy version. It's actually the one I showed you in those amazing sort of examples at the beginning. So let's tell you how I scaled it up. How we scaled it up as from the diffusion policy. So ResNet is now CLIP. That's not surprising. We're using a CLIP language encoding. It's mostly frozen. We just apart from the layers, the connectivity tissue, right? We're using DIT now instead of UNet. Okay, but actually we're not that much bigger in terms of number of parameters. When you add it all up, nowadays we tend to share the image encoders when we used to have separate image encoders. There's a pile of tricks, which I'm happy to talk about, that we've sort of learned over the years. But we're going to talk about training hundreds and hundreds of skills with a model that's only a few times bigger than what we had in diffusion policy. And the reason for that, I think 150 million was a lot of parameters for a diffusion policy, and that was probably more about the optimization landscape than about the capacity of the model. Okay, so I'll focus on this one because there's nothing that outperforms it in terms of the Dexterous capabilities in our lab, okay? It's one of the best. And it's just fundamentally simpler to study. If you're really trying to dig in and say, what is the source of these dynamic, the way my feedback control changed, the way my stability changed, then language complicates that story. And so there's a second talk I would love to give about the way language enters more deeply into this, but I'm going to defer that. I'm not as far along in my thinking with that. And the thing I give up by doing this really is that these models don't language steer as well as the VLAs, right? So sometimes I'll ask it to do something and it'll just do a different task that was in the pre-training mix. So for this set of experiments, we locked the data a little while ago when we were at our high quality, long duration, 500 skills mark, roughly. It was a little bit more than 500 skills. And it's mostly this real data. OXE by volume is larger, but we batch balance that down to be a pretty small effect on the total training. And we have this little wedge of simulation data, okay, which seems weird, right? If you love simulation, then why shouldn't you have a lot of simulation data? And that's coming, but not for this experiment. Why is the sim data so small? The experiment we're doing here, we're actually just using sim basically to help the evaluation. Okay, so we do a lot of real-world teleoperation. We have great robot teachers, and we took those same imitation learning teleoperation pipelines and we applied them in sim. We have a corresponding data set in sim. We have a small set of evaluation tasks that we constantly run. And really, those are just there to carry our real-world data into sim so that we can trust our real-world sim. Surrogate for real-world, our sim is a surrogate for real-world performance. Okay, so let's dig into how we actually do some of the testing. So first of all, A/B testing is really, really important. So you have to say, if I tested a policy yesterday, that's great, I got some results yesterday, but if I have a new policy I want to test today and I want to compare it to that other policy, I have to rerun. That data yesterday is gone. Basically, it's stale. Something changed about the world. I'm always constantly running both policies that I'm trying to compare. I can't reuse the old data. Always, when the evaluation's running, you have to run blind randomized trials. So the person doing the eval doesn't know if it's a single task diffusion policy or a multitask or whatever. We set up GUIs to sort of help the evaluation to contain and make more consistent the initial condition distributions and the like. So this is just one example. We say we want the scene to look like this. There's an overlay of the desired scene with the actual scene, and the evaluators will just snap things into place. This is a little bit of a tax on our evaluation rate, but it allows us to have a much more controlled set of initial conditions. And then we don't just ask success rate, we ask about task completion, we ask about, was it jittery, did it pause, did it do the wrong task? There's a bunch of things we try to collect that are sort of beyond the success rate. Okay, and then we do a lot of simulation-based testing. This is actually, I really don't know how we would do it without this at this point. And it's not perfect, I'll tell you some of the nuances, but it's essential to our workflow. So basically all the models that we're training, every interval checkpoint, we kick off an automatic eval in the cloud, we get our numbers back, it shows up on the leaderboard, you can scan the videos, you can see what happened. And extra work of scanning scanning into the videos and figuring out what happened, that's a big part of the work. So we have different philosophies for simulation for different parts of the workflow. So for data generation, I think we should be using generative assets, we should be using real-to-sim, we should be doing all the stuff to get as much diversity and as much content into our simulation as possible. But for testing, I feel a little differently. We're actually, we're only going to run all of those evaluations on a handful of scenes. So since we're running so many checkpoints through this, I'm actually going to take time. I'm going to let artists make the assets. I'll let the physicists touch up the contact parameters. I want this thing to be bulletproof. No weird policy is going to make some strange physics happen in this simulator, right? So that's the philosophy is this is the place where you want high quality. You want a low sim to real gap. We tend to come up with handfuls of scenarios to do that, and 10 tasks, greater than 10 tasks per scene, so that the task is not visually obvious, and you have to pay attention to the language in order to accomplish the task. And then, just like in real, we try to just capture about 200 demonstrations per task. With a little quality assurance, it's 199 or 2, whatever, about 200 demonstrations per task. And that, again, is meant to bring our real-world data into sim. Okay, why do I like simulation for testing? I mean, the fact that it runs automatically on the cloud is of course, a big thing. But the repeatability is so valuable. Anybody who's done real-world eval knows how painful it is. And to be able to run a policy last week and then know that those scores are still valid this week is just so valuable, okay? Also, we can just run many, many more rollouts. So we get much better statistics of slightly the wrong distribution, but we get much better statistics, okay? We've done work with Mac and others on those statistics. Okay, yeah, and then we run automatically and things just appear magically on the leaderboard, and it's just a really effective way to have the folks working on the policy to get their results back. Strong correspondence with real, but not perfect, right? We work as hard, I think, as anybody on our simulator. But I think if I were to tell you it's a perfect match, that would be glossing over a lot of nuance. There's just a lot of small things that can take the policy and simulation on a different path than it does in real. Maybe you don't put enough noise in your joint encoders or something like that, and so it latches on to this like nice clear signal in a way that it wouldn't have done in real. You know, you find these, you knock them down, but there's still a lot of them. Okay, so I'll show plots with confidence intervals. Okay, so we'll do this partly with just the Fuma IID. We'll do a Klopper-Pearson sort of standard interval analysis here. So when you see a plot like this, and I'm talking about a checkpoint versus another checkpoint, there'll be a mean and there'll be the 95% confidence intervals, upper bound and lower bound. So if I want to say something like, I made a substantial difference, checkpoint A is better than checkpoint B, then a sufficient condition for that is that this checkpoint is safely above this lower point. Sufficient but not necessary condition. Okay, but let me just, I said checkpoint for the first time there. That just, it means one of the models, one of the sets of parameters in my model training. I said this, I'm going to pull this checkpoint off. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that the statistics I have are about checkpoints, not about architectures. I'd love to say that flow policy is better than diffusion policy or vice versa, right? But that's actually a much harder statement to make, and we often don't spend enough compute to make that. There are many sources of randomness in the pipeline. Of course, different objects, environments, initial conditions. Even the diffusion being a stochastic policy, right? It's going to do different rollouts because we want it to be, we encourage our diffuser to be, denoiser to be stochastic. But the big one is that there's randomness in training, right? And we're including this, but it's very expensive. At some point, we're going to have to just bite the bullet and do that and capture all of our variance to make these statements. But it's very expensive, and it's going to require training a bazillion policies to do that. And the language, the computer vision community has done this. That's how, if you think ResNet just popped out, you're not acknowledging how many ResNets they trained to make that happen. And the language community has done this, and the robotics community is going to have to do this at some point, but we haven't done it yet. And then also, as you'll see in some of the plots, there is a high variability across tasks. There's some tasks that things work very well, some tasks they don't work well. Sometimes I have a clear explanation for why, sometimes I don't, right? So we have to acknowledge that the choices I made about which tasks affect my statistics, okay? And that's not captured. Okay, how many rollouts do we need to start making statistical arguments? If I have n rollouts, and I talk about an empirical mean of my Bernoulli process, then the mean is always just the success rate p. Okay, but the variance goes like p times 1 minus p over n, right? So if I make a plot that goes from success rate 0 to 50%, it's symmetric on the other side. I could have plotted the whole thing, but it's symmetric since it's p times 1 minus p. Then what is the width of that confidence interval? And unfortunately, if you only do 10 rollouts, then the width in the worst case is like 60-some%, right? So if you're trying to say that checkpoint A is better than checkpoint B and you've run 10 rollouts, it's like, I don't know how you fit that in 100 points, right? If you do 20 rollouts, you get better, and it's a trade-off. It's so expensive to do these, right? So we have decided for the single task results we'll show today, we'll budget 50 rollouts to get ourselves down into this sort of smaller confidence interval. Okay, and in sim we can do many more. That's for a single task. Things get more powerful when you start doing multitask. So our real multitask and our sim multitask, that's when we can start talking about averaging over all of the tasks where we start getting our small confidence intervals and nice separation claims. Okay, I'm sorry to harp on it, but this is like, it's a painful reality of doing these tests. Okay, so is checkpoint A better than checkpoint B? So a sufficient condition is that they separate, but it's not a necessary condition. You can do better with some adaptive testing. You have to really watch out for these things. So, if you know about p-hacking is a real danger in this world. It would be very tempting to run some number of experiments, see if your confidence intervals separate. If they don't, run some more experiments, and you're not allowed to do that. That's p-hacking, right? So you have to come up with the policy, basically, an adaptive testing framework that allows you to say that with 95% confidence, my policy A is better than policy B. The mean is above, for instance. And so the other way I'll show, because the confidence intervals don't tell the whole story, the other way I'll show some of these results is as with these basically plotting the posterior of a Bayesian analysis that shows the distribution. And then you can start to see there's a whole distribution of possible outcomes here. And sometimes those distributions, even if their tails overlap, you can still, with probability, separate them. So this common letter display is one way to say that. So if it says AA, for instance, that means they're in the same equivalence class. You couldn't separate them. But if it says AB, that means there was with statistical confidence, we can say there's a strict ordering in those performance. Okay, now here's maybe a philosophical point that I want to make here is, so we're in the low data regime. We're doing 200 demonstrations per task. Gemini robotics, for instance, does many, many more. We've never done that. The tasks that we're showing are intentionally difficult. Like the initial conditions are crazy in simulation. Sometimes we have cameras that are moving on every different rollout. Okay, we make these things intentionally hard. Why? If you're trying to understand the policy, the changes that you're making in the policies, well, let me say it the other way. If I was trying to impress you with my success rate, I would not do that, right? But if I really just sincerely want to learn about the policies, then the right thing to do is to stay away from those tails where you lose information and put yourself in the middle of the distribution and run lots of tests. That's the place where you learn the most, okay? But it means I have to stand in front of you and show you some of my skills have 20% success rate and some of them have 80% success rate, and I'm proud of that, okay? But you just have to give up, because I don't care how good your policy is, you can do adaptive stress testing. I mean, in driving again, we used to talk about the simulator should be like driving in downtown New Delhi all the time, because that's how you learn. You put the hardest possible conditions, right? Okay, and I think really maybe just, this whole idea of trying to, I have to convince myself in order to convince you, I think you really have to live that. Like, there's 1,000 small decisions that were made in the course of creating the results I'm about to show. We found a small thing that called a bug or something we should have done better. And every time you hit one of those, always there's a strict decision. Basically, do we retrain the policy? Do we rerun the evals, right? So if it makes LBM stronger, we don't do it just because we don't have time. If it makes the single task stronger, the single task is the opponent, then you must run it, right? Every advantage has to be given to the weaker player, okay? So we've made 1,000 little small cuts that slowly cut away at the LBM performance, just so I'm confident to say that what we said here. And there's just no way that the single task is going to be better, to the best of our abilities with 95% confidence. Okay, so let's dig into some of the results here. First, some high-level observations, right? There are some architectural changes that just help, like, especially as you go to the multitask, the bigger encoders just work better. DIT's scales better than UNet. The relative action parameterization that I think was first published in the UMI paper, it really does do better statistically. But a lot of the things that we thought were important, a lot of the architecture changes that we spent a lot of time talking about and were very excited about, ended up actually disappearing in the noise. We were pretty convinced for a little while, and then you keep running the test, and it's like, oh, that one's gone, Okay, yeah, we've often convinced ourselves something improved until all the tests came back. And I have to say, some of the changes we make, and as we get better at these games, right, we're going to get to the point where we're going to try to say this architecture change or this data change made me 1% better. That is a very hard claim to make today. If it's a 10-point change, we're good. If it's a 1-point change, we're going to have to change we're going to have to get bigger data to do that. Multitask pre-training does safely cut through the noise, right? A lot of our things don't matter. Multitask stands out. It really does make a big difference, okay? And actually, a lot of other engineering details do. Nobody really wants to write a paper about data normalization, but it's like 40 times more important than architecture or something like that, right? I mean, really, it was actually like 40 points better than the difference between DP and flow policy for us. Okay, so let's go through some of the specific results. So just as a warm-up, one of the things we wanted to make sure was correct was that our slightly scaled up multitask diffusion policy could learn all the tasks, okay? So just the experiment here is we're going to take our pre-trained LBM, and we have 200 demonstrations approximately, sometimes more, sometimes less, on all the tasks, okay? And we'll use those same 200 to train a diffusion policy on the tasks. And these are seen tasks, so it's tempting to call it zero shot, but it's in the pre-training mix. It's just not in. There's no post-training. We're just going to take our LBM pre-training and apply it immediately to the tasks that were in distribution, but with new initial conditions. Okay, and I want to compare that versus I just took one at a time, 200 demonstrations, and trained a single diffusion policy. Okay, and here's the violin plots popping up. And I put in more detail than you could possibly parse just so you can see some of the complexity here. So for lots of skills, I would have been happy, by the way, if this just was flat, if everything was flat. That would say my multitask policy learned as much as my single task policies, okay? In fact, it's more nuanced. We see some policies, the pre-trained multitask is just better, which is kind of what we hoped, that we'd see some transfer. Lots of times they're similar. Sometimes it's worse, okay? Again, like this is again like a scientific method thing, but I could have just disappeared these columns. Those tasks just never appeared, and my stats would go woof, and you'd be much more impressed, right? Don't do that. Don't do it. Okay. Instead, what you do is every time you see something like that, that's gold. You go into your logs and you figure out what the heck is happening there. The first one that stood out to me is this one hanging out at the bottom. Like, what is that? Put banana on saucer? How is that? Like, we're cutting apples, and we're like, why is put banana on saucer down at the bottom? And it turns out it's because of because it's the multitask diffusion policy. So we go into our leaderboard, we pull out our video, and it turns out it always puts the orange on the saucer. We must have too much orange in our pre-training mix. So it just like refuses to do the banana, picks up the orange every time. But it always puts something on the saucer. Okay, so that's just really because the language steering is not good. Okay, getting into the hypotheses. So by training on many tasks, we can add new tasks more quickly. So I really wanted a plot where you say the number of skills goes up, and then how many skills would it take, how many demonstrations would it take to get to 80%? That is the right concept, I think, but that would take so many experiments to make that plot. That was not the right axes. So instead, we're going to show something a little different, but making the same point. So now we're going to fine-tune into new tasks. So we'll take our pre-trained model. I've got a new task, my 1001th task, if you will. I'm going to train against 200 demonstrations on that versus pre-training and then fine-tuning with 200, just like we talked about at the very beginning. And these are safely out of the pre-training distribution. Now, how do you so we have literally been doing almost anything you can think of doing with two arms bolted to a table for the last 2 years. Like people have to get creative to come up with the next thing that you haven't already done with two hands bolted to a table. It's two arms bolted to a table. So the way we did it, we said, let's do some crazy, apple coring, for instance, was one of our sort of crazy, long horizon, clearly not in our pre-training mix. So we came up with like clearly novel tasks just to make sure that we were safely unseen. And these are the kind of plots that we're able to make now. So the axis here is if I use all 200 demonstrations, or if I use just 100 demonstrations, 50% of the data, or 15% of the data. Okay, and the single task policy, benefits a lot. They both benefit, of course, from having more data. But what's interesting and consistent, very consistent across these different runs, okay, is that the pre-training allows you to do much better with less demonstrations. Okay, so we do see this kind of, and we see a glide path. So LBMs, the pre-training really do improve rapidly with less demonstrations. On tasks it's not really about generalization here. This is about dexterity, right? This is about did I sheath the knife properly? Are my eigenvalues better? And are my recoveries more pronounced? These are like fundamental dynamics and control things that are happening because of the pre-training. Okay. We have a bunch of tasks in sim even that were intentionally very difficult, and we include those, and all our performance drops into like our please forgive my 25% success rate, but the trends continue even for our different battery of tasks. We've done less of these in real, although they're actually running right now, the partial, but all of the real results we've gotten so far, you don't expect the absolute to match. Remember, the philosophy here is you have to compare relative. The total performance is task dependent, but we see very consistent trends in terms of the relative gains of the pre-training in real versus in sim. And just to show that there's lots and lots of details here. There's some really hard tasks that get some really low, but the averages do separate, I showed. Okay, and in real, we see the same thing. What's interesting is the bike rotor install, which I'll show at the end, is actually one of the hardest tasks. We rarely get all the way to the end. The success rate is low, but like Pi, for instance, has been using task completion as the metric, and I think that's great. I think that is strong, and it shows a lot more signal in something like the bike rotor, or the apple coring, where you go, very successfully chop an apple, and then you miss the last step of sheathing the knife or something like that. So I will talk at the end about some of how that affects. Sadly, it doesn't change the statistical strength significantly. That's a very subtle argument. We're going to try to write it up carefully in the draft, but you might think that the statistical weakness is just because we're doing binary success failure, but so far continuous metrics are, they tend to have lower variance, but they also have closer means, so it takes just as many samples to separate them. And it's a subtle argument. I was convinced it was going to help, but actually statistically it's still a weak position. Hypothesis 2 was about robustness, okay? So I'm going to do the same experiments I just showed from the seen and unseen tasks, but this time we're going to go, at least in simulation, we're going to go really crazy. We're going to have, lights changing, background changing, cameras moving on every rollout, okay? In the real, we'll do less of that, but still try to put novel objects in and the like. But really, I didn't actually realize until surprisingly recently that actually our distribution shift on was moving the cameras as much as it's moving. It's really hard. Okay, which is why we get low scores, but very consistent improvement from the single task versus the LBM. And I'd say this is probably the strongest result that we've seen, is that consistently in these hard tasks, distribution shift, hard scenarios, we see that basically that LBMs achieve, the pre-training allows us to achieve comparable performance to single task with 15% of the data. That seems more invariant than some of the other numbers we've seen. For instance, when we put in very difficult tasks, we still see, somehow a lot of the performance even at 15% of the data. Okay, there's lots and lots of details that I can go into. We've done things like distribution shift in hardware, measured similar things, trying to vary from the more demonstrations to less demonstrations. The trends are all pretty consistent. This one I singled out because it's actually just useful as a roboticist. So we used to worry before that it would be, if we did our demonstrations on station 1, then we would do our rollouts on station 1, right? You wouldn't often try to train a diffusion policy on one station and then apply it on a different station. Partly because we don't work super hard to make our stations identical. We just mount cameras where we mount cameras. We try not to bump the cameras, but we don't try to make things perfectly identical. And what we see is that, maybe not surprisingly, is that the pre-training helps you now deploy on new stations, right? So this one, the single task baseline had 4 different stations collecting data, and so it had a little bump, a little improvement in performance. The one where the initial data collect was done on only 2 stations, the pre-training made a really big change to how much robustness you have if you go to a novel station. So it's just nice to finally feel like you could deploy on a different system. Yeah.
It's really interesting analysis about robustness. It seems like this is primarily visual robustness, right? How do you think about physical robustness? I think I've seen some of those LBMs be able to like miss the grab on the banana and still retry.
Yep.
And how do you think you can measure things like that?
So what makes you say that that's a great question. I should repeat it. So is this more about visual robustness than physical robustness? What makes you think it's visual robustness?
I think earlier you described that you're varying the lighting.
I thought moving the cameras as much as we were is crazy. I shouldn't have overemphasized that. We're also doing crazy things to the physics parameters. Yeah, it's really meant to be both.
Like for your simulation experiments, you vary the physical parameters.
Yes. Sorry, we're randomizing all the things.
Okay.
Shape, geometry. Well, not shape, maybe because it's they're meshes, but basically every parameter that you could try to randomize, we try to randomize. So it's intentionally meant to be interrogating physical robustness in addition to visual. In fact, I think the visual robustness is. This is maybe my bias as a control guy. Maybe less interesting. Like I think the pre-trained image encoders are very strong. So you kind of out of the box get pretty good visual robustness. But that's probably my bias. Yeah. Okay. The funny thing is that really, like I said, it's the little things like the normalization. So I could tell you what first step normalization is. We do these relative action trajectories now. So everything is in relative coordinates, but it's not relative. It's not like delta coordinates because then you'd worry about sort of drift. We do it from time zero. We're gonna predict 16 seconds, 1.6 seconds into the future. We write all of the action commands for those 16 seconds relative to time. We call it time 1 because let's call it time 0. It's clearer. Okay. Right? So the statistics of what your 16th step looks like relative to your first step are different. And for a long time, just because it was the obvious first thing to do, we were using the same normalizer for that entire trajectory. And it's like an obvious, simple thing, just to compute the statistics differently, independently for all of those steps into the future. And it made like a 20-point difference in some of our results, right? And you have to clip it in the right way. Those things, again, it's not what people write papers about, but they make a huge difference. A couple other takeaways, since I know we have a lot of domain experts around. Always in our diffusion, I think diffusion more generally, but certainly in diffusion policy, we know that validation loss, we call it val action MSE, doesn't correspond to, that's kind of like open loop prediction. And open loop prediction is not predictive of closed loop performance. So you really have to run a simulation to know which model is best, okay? And in particular, we tricked ourselves. We thought, okay, well, at least for just checking, so we train, let's say 100 checkpoints, 100K steps. We'll look at 100, 90, 80, and pick the best one. It's not always 100, which is bad and broken, but that's fine. So we'll just put that on the shelf for a second. But so let's say the 90 has the best val action MSE. Okay, that's not enough. You got to do the rollouts even to just pick which checkpoint. The data quality still matters, even when you have the pre-training. We see that making sure, so the way we talk to, the way we sort of do our demonstrations is say, please think a bit about how the robot might fail and give some examples of recoveries. And if you don't do that, it's worse, okay? I think maybe in the limit where the pre-training is strong enough, it won't make a difference. But right now, it still matters. And beware of looking just at in-distribution performance, particularly in sim, when evaluating the pre-training. So it wasn't until we really started doing the more aggressive testing that we felt like we were making better decisions based on our sim-based testing and mapping to real. Okay. I do think success rate is a limiting thing, right? And this is real. I actually think this is great. I've heard this a few times, and I think it's true. I think the robot teachers will say it, right? You kind of like that policy is just better. Like it's just better. I can guarantee it's better. So here's just a time lapse, right, of that apple coring. It's so when you see the camera moving like this, that is to show you that there's no cuts, right? It never jumps. Okay, and it's going to fail a bunch, and you'll see the guy, like it misses the knife at the end. Okay, but what you see is that it's just the LBM version, the pre-trained version just looks better. It like, when it does fail, I mean, apart from the knife missing, which is kind of forgivable in my opinion, but it never does something that looks like, it always looks like manipulation, right? It's just always trying, it's always doing something, and there's something qualitatively good about what's happening. And so if you dig in, we can see this statistically in our rubrics. It pauses less. They complete tasks at a higher completion rate. We can make our plots at all the failures and see that it gets farther into the task more often. These are the sort of Sankey plots where you can talk about all the different ways that it fails. And if you get all the way to the end and you're not red, then you've succeeded. And the single task version, you just see lots more early exits, right, where it failed for some early part of the task. And the LBM fine-tuned. These, again, are like the really hard, long horizon tasks. So, yeah, and so many, many different ways to sort of see that you get a lot farther into the task. And you do qualitatively better with the softer metrics with the LBMs. And so, Mark Rayburd used to always have a slide at the end called it the unvarnished truth, right? So I thought I'd put the unvarnished truth in. So we actually just used our rubrics to look back through all of our videos and said, what is the worst? Like the worst one we've ever seen. And the single task poly, so this is not cherry picked, but it's maybe a little unfortunate for diffusion policy. It happened to drop, and the bike rotor kind of went out of the scene. The very worst thing we saw in the bike rotor for the LBM fine-tuned, let's just watch. It's almost endearing, I think. So it failed, okay, but it tried again. Okay, and this thing just keeps failing and keeps trying and trying and trying until it gets its arm stuck, basically. It's like scene camera is wedged in the bike, and then at some point someone said, okay, that's enough, take it out of its misery. And that seems to be the story, is it just keeps, like a little bump there, a little engine that could, and in a way that I think this is the story of pre-training, is somehow we get these things that just have more. I think they have more. It's very hard to quantify. I wish I had a really rigorous way to quantify that they were sort of had more recovery behaviors available. We're working on those ideas too. Okay, so maybe this is one way to say it. So this is actually something we've been saying for a while, that GPT doesn't always get the right answer, right? But even the early versions of GPT, they always generated beautiful prose, right? And I think roughly what we're seeing is that LBMs don't always accomplish the task, but it always looks like manipulation. It really does. If you just so we put random. This was actually before it had ever seen the towel. This was a novel objects thing. We just put random things in front of the robot, and we told it nothing, right? Or you can say do something useful, or something that's an outer distribution. Do something useful is actually in Droid, but you could give it arbitrary tasks, and it just starts playing. There's no other way to describe it. It just starts doing. It never sits still. You can walk up and you could put a banana in front of it. It'll go, whoa, and grab the banana, and it'll do a handover with the banana and put it over there for no reason. It's not listening to you. It's just playing, and that is, I think, the story is that we used to see, it would do the right task, or it would kind of get stuck and pause, or maybe it would go a little unstable off to the side, and now it doesn't always do the right task, but it almost always does manipulation. And I would say, maybe even philosophically, that this is what we want to see from pre-training, right? So if you believe in RL post-training, I think people do, then really the role for pre-training is to try to get 5 to 10% success rate on any possible task. That's what we want. Because if you can, the DeepSeek story was, it solves the pre-trained model, the base model was solving competition math at 5%. Okay, and once that happens, you just roll it out a few times and increase the good ones, and RL can do wonders, right? And so I think that we're going to see the same thing, of course, in manipulation, probably in simulation first, but this is coming for sure. So the first principle is you must not fool yourself. I really tried to give you a deep dive into multitask pre-training and present evidence supporting that we're going to put on archive very soon here. Simple thing was that LBMs can learn all the tasks. We haven't crippled our model in any silly way. That they enable learning skills more quickly, that they improve robustness, and data normalization matters, like, of course. But it still stands out to me as like, I cannot believe that was the biggest change we ever made. I think as a field, we need to acknowledge that we're in a very weak statistical position. It's very hard to do rigorous statistics at this scale, right? And so I think we need to think about very clever ways to address that. There's a lot more to do. And so I'll look ahead just a little bit here at the end. I know that's the conclusion, but we do have a collaboration with Boston Dynamics now. It's pretty awesome. Those guys are amazing. Their robot is amazing. Their controller is amazing. So the real results are coming soon, but I just want to give you a little sneak peek with what you can do with amazing whole body teleop, right? So this is an early video of Electric Atlas. You can imagine but it's a nice one to sort of show what you could do. But imagine if you've got a decades-old MPC controller, something that's been matured over decades. It's a new controller, but it's something that's been matured for a long time. You can do really dynamic tasks. This guy can jump, he can do all these things. I like this video because for some reason, Kevin decided to do a pistol squat. If you don't know what a pistol squat, you're about to see. And I don't know if Kevin also fell down, but the robot, that was the MPC controller catching the robot, right? So imagine having this blanket of protection around that's Lucas, yeah? So, just jumping around, okay. So, and it's useful too. You can kind of get into places you wouldn't have gotten into otherwise if you can really use your whole body. A lot of the humanoid imitation learning demonstrations right now are standing in front of a table and doing stuff. It's a little bit more than tabletop manipulation, but so coming soon. I'll take questions, and maybe while I do, I will just show you the spike rotor, which is one of my favorite tasks here in the background. Yes?
Thank you for the talk. Can you expand more about the notion of unseen task?
Yeah.
Is that about unseen objects or unseen skill or unseen combination?
Great. So in simulation, it's very clean. We make a handful of scenarios, a handful of tasks in each scenario. They're all intentionally different, and we just subset them. We're going to, it's kind of our validation set. Scene, train, validation. Okay, it's very clean, and we can look at the description files and know that they're different. The reason it's more subtle in real is because we've been collecting all kinds of arbitrary data for a couple of years now. And so we were more worried about saying like, okay, have we ever put a banana on a saucer before? I don't know. It could be hidden in the data. So in order to make something that was convincingly out of the scene, the pre-training mix, we did these. We call them extravaganza, like this bike rotor thing. Yes?
Thank you for the great talk. I was wondering whether you have any tips or finding learnings that you can communicate to the field about how to create really good simulators that we can use to evaluate.
Yeah.
You have 10 high quality ones. If everyone contributes one, I feel like we could go really far away in large scale simulation evaluation of many different tasks.
Awesome. I'll repeat just for the video or whatever, but okay, so what can we do about, or what can I say about making simulations? So first of all, Sharon's been on me to release our simulation-based eval, and we have a beta version that's ready. So I've been listening, and Jeremy and others have been working very hard. So we are going to try to release ours. The one we'll release is probably our first 4 scenarios because we've hammered on them the most. It's easy to add more, but again, that's the place where we've really actually carefully curated the art and whatever. I can say a lot about the simulation. Maybe the highest level is that Isaac and Mujoko are super fast. They're way better than Drake for large-scale parallel testing. Drake has always been tried to be closer to real, so put more fidelity in the contact parameters. It's a little harder to use. But for now, this is just, you can just use it in the cloud. You just give me a checkpoint, it'll run. You don't have to understand Drake diagrams. So I don't know how much that matters. I think you can domain randomize yourself out in RL training over sim fidelity issues. Eval is a little bit different. So I have the most experience with Drake. We've seen good correspondence, not perfect correspondence. Sometimes we think, for instance, that the simulator seems to lean on the risk cameras a little bit more than the scene cameras compared to real. Why? We're trying to dig into, there's little things that are anomalies, but it's a pretty good indicator, and we're going to keep making it better and better. So I think if we look ahead, so LLM evals, people just collect evals, right? And we should have that same thing here. So you should have, hopefully you'll have LBM eval as one of your choices, and you'll run it every time you put a checkpoint on, and you'll have some others, and we'll see which ones correspond to the best correspondence with real. And I would love for you to add 10 more scenarios or any, to scale that.
To talk, and my question is about the generalization over the skills and the generalization over the distributions. Like, have you quantified the importance of generalization not pre-trained data with different camera angles and different kind of tables and with different setup of the knowledge representations, and then how important or how helpful it is for the generalization for the new tasks and new distributions.
Very good. So what about generalization? So there's great work. I think, I don't know if you can hear, but there, people have made the axes of generalization that you want to measure. We haven't cut it up like that and done specific tests. What we try to do is make a single out-of-distribution generalization test, which changes all these things, and that we want to probe. I think we're probably probing all the same axes that other people are. Sometimes harder, or like in larger distributions. But we have not made separate plots for each axis. We could. It's an interesting question. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you see as the role for more like model-based techniques going forward with those if there's one?
I always get this question. What is the role for model-based techniques? So there are plenty of places where model-based techniques could snap into the pipeline for data generation, for analysis, things like this. But I want to give you a higher level answer. Okay, so I'm still working on model-based things too. Even if they aren't going to be the things that run on the robot. So the problem with the work I feel that's happening here for me personally, this is just me, Russ as a person. We're very early stages. It's very messy. It's very hard to think deeply and ask narrow questions that you get concise answers. The model-based is so much more mature, and I think people should experience the maturity of thought that can go with some of those methods, and I worry that not everybody will. So I think that's a really important. I think we should expect these worlds to come together in terms not in terms of like we're going to use sums of squares or whatever. That might be different, but Lyapunov functions are Lyapunov functions. Stability is stability. Robustness is robustness. Those things are coming together. They're different paths up the same mountain or something. I don't know. But the risk here is that, it's the opportunity is that we've opened up new vistas, whole new questions, lots of incremental things that we have to do to kind of make progress on that. But that is a very different experience, intellectual experience, than really deeply understanding a mountain of knowledge and trying to find a way to advance. I think both are super valuable. Yeah. Yes?
So after all the sim and real evals that you've done, how much do you trust simulation as an evaluation tool? Like if you had to choose between model A and model B, how close are you to being like, you only need to test this in simulation?
Great. Yeah, so how much can we actually just test simulation?
Yeah.
So the first answer is I think we must trust simulation because, oh my God, real world eval is so painful. It is so expensive. It's so stressful. He's like, oh my God, it can't be the answer. Maybe I've heard clever ideas about crowdsourcing this and whatever. I think there could be ways that you bust that open, but it is painful. It is painful. So we must trust simulation. I would rather make a mistake because my simulator was a little different than put everybody through what he has been through in the last few months, okay? So that's one answer. Second answer is that I do think there are many things where it does transfer. Like a lot of our stats, the ones we showed, they really do. You see a performance jump in simulation, we expect and see the same performance jump. There are still cases where it's like, why did it do that? And it's just a constant. I mean, the same thing happened when we were working on RL, for instance. You have a physics engine; it's pretty hardened. But that RL will find a way to beat your to put your simulator in a way. I remember we were doing, putting plates in the dish rack. And there was some instability in the simulator. You could basically play tiddlywinks with the plate and it would go into this, And RL found that, and that was annoying, and then you make your simulator better, and then you do that enough times and you whack down all the things that pop up, and you get there. So we're pretty far on that journey, but not all the way. So I think already most of our work, most of our decisions are made in simulation, and we just post hoc check. And I think we'll get to the point very soon where we just, we really, really trust it.
Yeah. I think it was a really interesting discussion about robustness and recovery behaviors. In my opinion, I think the recovery behavior is most interesting because actually, say visual robustness, you're still doing the same action, and hopefully it should still work. Or if it's different friction, you still mostly do the same thing, hopefully it still works. But recovery behavior sounds like an entirely different kind of beast. How do you measure if your system does recovery behaviors, and how do you make sure you elicit it the right amount without intentionally collecting bad demos?
Oh,
we might do bad
good.
things intentionally, more than shift.
Okay, that last part was a great, but maybe slightly separate question. So the first thing so the question is about recovery behaviors and how do we study them. I mean, first of all, we don't actually ask our teachers to label them as it happens. Maybe we should, but right now we're doing that as post hoc analysis. And we're trying to find clever ways, and ideas are welcome, to sort of compare to say, was that recovery something that came from this skill, or did that come from another skill? Or, trying to find what's the most similar in the right feature space, of, and thinking about things like that, okay? The recovery happen even in the single skill. They happen more often in the LBM pre-trained. We think, but we have not yet been able to prove, just because there's these questions, is whether they're coming from more diverse sources when they recover. Okay, and then maybe the second question was, how do you teach recovery behaviors? So we have traditionally done what we call batch dagger, which is, so we'll collect the first 200 demonstrations or whatever, and then if we see it recover, and we try to say, think about ways it might have failed, and so maybe you dropped the wrench, so put it in a place where you might not have set it initially, but it might have fallen, pick it up from there, and give me a demonstration that includes that, okay? But in particular, after we've trained the first policy, we would say, okay, we've seen it fail in a handful of ways, give me new demonstrations recovering from that failure. The more elegant version of that, which is online but not in this data set, is to sort of do constant recovery during evaluation, right? HG dagger, for instance, right? So that's all, yeah, I think that's all fairly good. We aren't as careful as we could be about cutting out failures from our data. They are just sitting there in the pre-training mix. We hope they are drowned out by being rare, you fail in different ways. But we could try to, when we have in the past tried to go in and look out and sort of dissect out the failures, it's a slippery slope. Because what is actually a failure? What do we cut? So we don't do that right now. Yeah.
It's a great talk, Russ. I have two questions.
Okay.
The first one is you have more than 200 apples. Who ate them?
Who ate the apples? I ate a few, for sure. You can only eat so many apples, right? Yeah. There was some. We tried not to make food waste. There was some food waste that day. Yeah.
My second question, which is related, is do you see a world where semi-eval can be applied to all kinds of scenarios, like with conformable objects, with liquids, or with apples?
Yes. So do we see a world where there are simulations? There's no question. I think we already know how to simulate all those things. We don't know how to simulate them with high fidelity at real-time rates, but that's coming. Yes, so it's coming to Drake's very specifically. Maybe not, the apple's not today, but all the liquids and deformables are in the pipeline and coming out very soon. And they're adding them now to our eval pipeline. So absolutely that's coming. The diversity is the real question, I think. Fidelity is not the thing that I worry about in sim. I think we know how to simulate. I mean, Zuchen, who's on our team, his thesis was like simulating bread, warming up in the oven and splitting, and it was a multi-particle method. I mean, you can simulate anything, okay? But getting the diversity of the simulation is the real question, and that's where I think all the great advances in real to sim are going to really, really help. So, yeah, I think that it has to be we have to make that work. Yes.
Are there changes in robot design that you'd like to see?
Oh, geez. So I'll tell you what, the question is about hardware design. So one of the things that Aloha definitely got right, that these arms just, and I know you know this, you've already done the work on this, but I just hate that we don't have a wrist here. It is like these top-down manipulators, hands down, they just get very limited because the last link is so darn long. Now, you've already had solutions to this, and we should be using them. What else? I mean, of course, the dexterous hands are coming. I think having more clever end effectors that allow hand reorientation without fingers, I think that's awesome. The question, of course, there is the total generality of it. Did you make some tasks easier, other tasks harder? The only real argument in favor of fully dexterous hands is just that we've seen humans do all the tasks we care about, roughly. But the rate of progress in low-cost dexterous hands is phenomenal. So that's, you won't see only these on our robots for very much longer.
What about force control and compliance?
Okay, so force control and compliance. So we're in a joint impedance control, and then we have a diff IK on top of that. We were talking earlier that we could have done that with operation space all the way, sorry. But it just maybe historically, because we were using the Franca stack impedance controller first. The joint impedance controller is essential to making these things work. We have seen tasks, like the one I think the most about is one of the early egg beater tasks. So we are holding one hand, and then we have this kinematic closed loop, but with a weird kinematic constraint. First of all, the human needed to get haptic feedback in order to feel that and operate it, and the joint impedance controller was absolutely saving us and allowing that to execute. We do collision avoidance, so we don't, if you notice, there's no scuff marks on the arms. We're pretty good. Even our policy is being protected with collision avoidance, low-level stuff, and the table also in the known. But once we go mobile, that stuff gets harder. So we're benefiting a lot from that. Do you need it in the fingers? I don't know. Of course, it's really a bandwidth. I mean, you know this. So it's really a bandwidth thing. You can act like a force source with position, but the question is really, guys, what's the right space to do your high frequency control? These policies are low bandwidth. So the diffusion policy is thinking about 10 hertz, but it's only doing inference at about 1 hertz, a little more than 1 hertz. So we're not in a force control regime with the big policies. We're relying on our low-level controller to do something like that. Thank you. Yeah?
So with all the impressive results you showed today, how far do you think we are from seeing robots actually be helpful at people's homes? And what are the major bottleneck or obstacles that we still resolve?
Good question. So how far are we from robots getting into homes? Okay, so the thing that's just amazing and is really, I mean, I couldn't have seen it coming as fast as it's coming, is that we're all going to have these foundation models for manipulation, right? And we're all going to have humanoids, or whatever the better design is, right? But it's still a really, really long path to having a product in the home. I think maybe people don't remember how hard it is to actually
Let's be more specific.
Okay.
Let's say we ignore cost. Let's say we ignore hardware capability. If we just focus on manipulation capability, do you think we have the recipe to achieve it? Yeah.
I see. So you're factoring out cost and hardware and stuff like this in terms of manipulation. I think we're on the path. I think the Pi 0.5 looked awesome. I think I don't see a ceiling for what we can do with the large-scale pre-training, but I think it is probably there, and we'll have to have. I mean, I believe we're going to have, with the current recipes, small changes on the current recipes, robots that are actually useful. Like, I think we have enough to kind of get to the next round. And then we'll have more robots out there. But I don't think we've solved it completely. Or maybe just for the journey, I hope there's another ceiling that we have to like think our way around. But I do feel like the stuff I've seen, the stuff that we read and see on YouTube and Twitter, is going to go a long way. And I think we'll have to be inventive about finding applications where you don't have to succeed at 100% success rate. Like, we're not going to start probably with like open heart surgery, but maybe putting away the towels is okay, or like, I don't know, picking fruit or something like that. Those seem safe, right? But if we are inventive as a community about finding those applications, I do think we have stuff that's going to get us there. But the supply chain matters, and the cost matters, and those are doozies. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. From the videos you've shown today, it seems like visual motor policy can push robots really far. I'm curious if you think with scale that's pretty much going to solve manipulation, or could there be other sensing modalities that can be critical?
Good question. Okay, so I almost never use the word solve. I think there will always be a next round. If only our understanding. I think our understanding here is so young. It's so naive. At some point, we'll have theorems that explain this stuff. We don't have those yet, right? I think, so first we have this sort of like very, you can look at the history of science. Okay, so maybe electricity and magnetism. So we're like, Volta was sticking electrodes in frogs, right? I think we're in the electrodes in frogs stage. It's pretty good. And then like Faraday came along and did really the right empirical science and kind of clarified the situation, dove in, found exactly the right quantities. And then it took a number of years later until we had Maxwell's equations that sort of cleaned it all up. I think the fact that people often say, well, this is just so much more complicated. It's all about the data. It's so big. I think that's just because we don't understand it yet. I think they're going to look different, but we're going to have the laws. We're going to have the principles. Maybe it's about the way you do a curriculum or whatever. We're going to have the core ideas, and we don't have that yet. It's going to take a long time to get there. We'll also have tactile sensors, if that's what you're asking. Yeah, okay, yes. I'm sorry to kind of go philosophical on you there. Yes?
What might be the next ceiling in your opinion?
The next ceiling.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a pretty clear glide path right now to just keep making these things better, but I don't know what the next one is, honestly. I think hardware is limiting at some point. Our current hardware is limiting, but I wish I had a more crisp answer to the request. I do think I feel limited often by the hardware. Yeah. Sure.
I have a question about human-computer interaction. So, like, how safe are the robots currently, and what are the steps to make it more safer to allow them to enter the home and other spaces?
Awesome. So, how safe are the robots? How do we get into the home? The safety case on this robot is based on the low-level controller. It's basically this joint impedance controller. It has a safety, like it won't hit you too hard. It could pick up a knife very slowly, and but there's a safety case around the physical contact force, right? That is a poor, that's not everything you need, but it's a start. That gets even harder when you're a humanoid robot or even a wheeled robot moving around the home. Proving that I'll never tip over is a pretty tough thing, right? I think 1X is awesome. They're building very lightweight robots, thinking safety from the hardware principles from the very beginning. I think we'll see more things like that. There's a hardware way to sort of work your way out of that. Having more data with people around is definitely on the roadmap. I think that's going to help. Just being more intuitive, meeting people's expectations about how to perform when those situations happen. But my prediction would be that the first robots in the home have a safety case that's something like, if a person comes within 10 feet of me, I'm going to turn off. And then we'll get better and better. But that could still be useful. That could still get robots out there being useful. Maybe it only goes in your apartment when you're out, but it's clean when you come back. I don't know. There's something like that. Yeah.
This might be a more vital question, but I'm wondering, because things are so sequential, and as these models grow larger and larger and more tasks, do you see there being a way to sort of speed up the robots in real time? like besides just kind of throwing GPUs at it?
Okay, so how do we do more dynamic tasks, for instance, like and have the robots moving faster? Is that kind of the question? I think we've seen some examples of people running policies that are architecturally similar to this at closer to like walking balancing rates. I think to do it with the whole visual motor policy requires some engineering. Warm starting, keeping your context alive, quantization, but we kind of know how to do all that stuff. It's just a matter of prioritizing it. The maybe surprising thing, not surprising, but the task, we found a lot of tasks, like we don't often feel limited by our control bandwidth. Like most of the tasks we're doing around, I mean, if we wanted to catch a ball being thrown at it, that would be tough. Throwing a ball is okay. Catching a ball is tougher, right, at this control rate. Or balancing a humanoid at this control rate would be probably a bad idea. But I think maybe there's I hope there's fundamentally new architectures that will make this even better. But I think if we didn't have them, we could just do better engineering on the ones we have and get pretty close. Yeah.
What are some lessons or interesting observations you had about quantifying the recovery behavior or correlating recovery behavior?
So how do we quantify recovery behavior? So I think right now the objectives are these slightly surrogate objectives about how far does it get into the task, how many times does it fail. We're working on like post hoc. We've done small amounts, like small chunks of our data. Humans have gone through and done extra annotations and the like. We're trying to automate that pipeline so we just always have that. I think that is going to open up the ability to sort of really measure these things for the whole data set. But we're still limited on our sort of counting and probing of those recovery behaviors. I'm actually very excited about this. And the thing I said before about eigenvalues and recovery, like this task, for example, is measurably better. Let me just play. It's measurably better, but actually not because of recovery maneuvers so much. It somehow just makes it through the task more often without making a mistake. So there's something about the rollouts that are kind of more stable. In my mind, that's kind of a continuous stability, a local stability. The apple coring, it has, for instance, it seems to have more recovery. That's more of a discrete stability, a second layer of stability. I think both are happening. But really, I think we need to keep thinking about how to probe that and understand that and connect it to Lyapunov and other things, right? I think there's a story there. Yes?
Can you discuss how singularities are handled?
So the low-level controller basically protects us from singularities. We have a diff-IK layer that basically does even if you do drive it, we do drive it in singularity sometimes, but we're getting better and better. Sometimes we have to improve it, but it does at least natural things when it gets to joint limits or singularities.
So does it recover from the singularity or does it avoid it?
I would like to say it never enters a singularity, but that's not true. And sometimes it recovers, and sometimes it gets restarted. But it was pretty good. I mean, the state, it's certainly not the policy that's keeping it out of singularities. It's the interface. Okay. Yes.
You mentioned early on in your talk that you were interested in video generation models.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you think the improvements that we see in video generation models informs your thinking on what data we should be collecting in robotics.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So how do video generative models sort of change everything? Okay, there's a question of like how would you use, if you had a world model, let's say an action condition video model, could you use that for eval? Could you use that for data gen? Could you use that as on time, test time inference or execution time inference? Probably all of those things. The first thing though for me is just having a different intermediate representation that was trained on these objectives to sort of predict future robot videos. And asking, is that a fundamentally different, maybe more 3D aware, maybe somehow a different representation to start from as a base layer. So I think that's coming. I don't know how it's going to compare with the VLA yet. We're going to find out soon. It's definitely a different angle. In the long run, I think internet data will win. I think probably we need a base of robot data so that you can know what force feels like and sort of know the details of your robot. But the common sense about the world, once we can build a bridge from our robot data into like watching human videos, that's like such a huge surplus of data that probably that's going to be, maybe we'll need 1% robot data and 99% everything else in the long run. But I do think we have to build that first foundation. I think if I was watching a You Do It video on YouTube and I had never touched the world, I think I would probably not get as much out of it as if I, had a lifetime of touching the world and now I watch the YouTube video.
It seems like you're being very careful about understanding what the model needs to perform well, and how are you going to go about understanding what is like the useful data to collect when you have all of this huge video data available?
Okay, so how do we understand the right value of data? I mean, I think already, even in the robot data, I mean, the language world, just to take a story, one of the stories that I'm familiar with, Ludwig he led a project called Data Comp LM, for instance, right? So you fix the architecture, you fix the training recipe, you fix everything, and then you just start subsetting the data. And the game is, what filters can you put on the data to get the strongest performance out for your language tasks, okay? And it turns out, I think, if you're similar to Wikipedia or like Reddit, are you smarter than a sixth grader? I think, that's a good classifier to like find. So there's a cool story like that. We're going to have the same thing for manipulation. I think we'll first collect a bunch of data. It'll be expensive. And then we'll start doing the ablations, and it's going to cost a fortune. But we'll start learning the lessons of what data is valuable empirically. I don't know a first principles way to do it. Faraday will come along soon, and Maxwell after that. But first, it's going to just be like a lot of GPU, I think. Maybe you have a better way, but.